soldier, statesman, orator, governor. These were but a few of the titles he had in his lifetime. But for those of us here with him, he was a son, a father, and for me, a husband. Richard and I had a couple of things in common. We both had been born in Georgia, and both of our fathers had brought their families to East Texas and established themselves as prominent planters. So it was only natural through our family's acquaintances that I would be introduced to him. On December 2nd, 1869, we were married. I was 20 years old and Richard was 37. My name is Janie Roberts Hubbard. Now, when I married Richard, he was a widower and the father of 2 surviving children from his first wife, Eliza. She had bore him 6 children. Their first child had been a son. They named him Thomas. Sweet little Thomas was the first to be laid to eternal sleep here in our family plot. He had only lived 1 year. So not only did I become a wife, I became a mother to Richard's 2 children. The oldest was a little girl named Serena. She had been named for Richard's mother. And then there was little Richard Bennett Jr., or as we called him, Little Benny. In 1873, I had Richard's and my first child, a son. His given name was Charles, but we always called him Charlie. Barely 1 year later, I was standing on the steps of the state capitol in Austin, witnessing Richard's inauguration as Lieutenant Governor of Texas. Richard's early years had been as a practicing attorney, then he had immersed himself into politics. When the war between the states began, he had formed his own regiment. He had also served as a state legislator. He also was known as a powerful orator. So I knew that service and politics were important to him. His commitment was obvious. So I made my commitment to support his endeavors. My own father had served in the Georgia Senate. I had been raised for politics, and my father had taught me so much. For that, I was thankful. In 1875, Richard was reelected to a second term as lieutenant governor. That same year, I gave birth to our second child, another son that we named Clarence. The joy of that birth was overshadowed with sorrow. Little Benny was 6 years old that year. He became ill. The doctor did everything he could, but he did not survive. It was heartbreaking to watch Richard lose another child, but we leaned on our Christian faith and we simply got on with life. When Governor Koch decided to resign to become a United States Senator, Richard became the 15th governor of Texas. I was 27 years old when we moved into the governor's mansion. My duties as the governor's wife kept me pretty busy. I had various social obligations. I ran the household, and of course I tended to our children. I always had functions that I had to be at Richard's side in my official capacity as First Lady. His 3 years in office passed quickly, and I think he was somewhat relieved when he did not get reelected. That meant that we could come home to Tyler. 1 year later, I had our third child, this time a daughter. We named her Circe. Two years later, we suffered our greatest sorrow. Charlie was 8 years old. Clarence was only 6 years old. Charlie became ill first. Oh, how he suffered. Despite our care and attention, he did not survive. 10 days later, we lost Clarence. The grief was unbearable. The doctor said it was that disease called diphtheria that had killed him. Richard had now buried 7 children, and I had mothered 3 of those. I think in order to deal with his grief, Richard poured himself into what he knew best, and that was politics. Grover Cleveland was running for president, and he asked Richard to do some campaigning for him. And when Cleveland was elected, he appointed Richard to be the United States Minister to Japan. The year was 1885, and our family set sail on a Pacific liner named the Tokyo. By this time, our oldest daughter, Serena, was married, and she and her husband joined Richard, myself, and our youngest daughter, Cersei. It was a long and tiresome journey. After days and days of travel, we were almost there. We could see the island right there on the horizon, and we struck a coral reef. There was fear and panic because we were sinking. Fortunately, another Japanese vessel came along and rescued us and got all the passengers safely to shore. By the time we arrived, my nerves were shattered. Now, living in a foreign land takes adjustment. I was fortunate that we had people there that helped with that transition. I did have to give some instructions to our Japanese cook on how to prepare Richard's favorite foods, Texas style. Perhaps for me, my favorite memory of Japan was when I was presented to the Empress in the Royal Palace. Just to see the inside of that palace, its beauty was exquisite, and it was surrounded on the outside by formal gardens. They were a sight to see. But I was to walk down a long aisle that went through the palace to the reception room where the Empress would be waiting for me. I was told that I was required to bow deeply 3 times on my way to the Empress. When I came before her, she addressed me. I was to bow once again, and then I had to back all the way down that same long aisle out of the palace. There was so much to see and experience in Japan, but I have to be honest, life had begun to take its toll on me. I had remained somewhat physically weak ever since the birth of my daughter, Cersei. Losing Charlie and Clarence the way we did, the mental anguish and the heartache, it had taken a physical toll on me. Then we received word from Texas. Both of my parents had died. It was more than I could bear. We were to be in Japan for 4 years. We had been there for 1.5 years when I became ill. The doctors suspected cholera. I simply could not fight it. On July 9, 1887, I left these earthly bonds for the heavenly realm. Now, you have to understand, it was not feasible for Richard to bring me home at that time. So he had my body prepared and placed in an above-ground vault. The Japanese government held a ceremony in my honor, full of pomp and circumstance. Now, our oldest daughter, Serena, and her husband, took our youngest daughter, Cersei, and raised her up as they 3 years later, Richard brought us all home to Tyler. The last part of the journey was by rail. We arrived here in Tyler at 2 a.m. The next day, I was brought here to Oakwood. Hear these words that Richard recorded in his diary on the events of that day. On this day, at 5:00 p.m., we laid to rest by the side of dear little Charlie and Clarence, their beloved mommy, for whose coming they had been waiting and watching at the Golden Gate. Very large numbers were at the grave and in the procession. Peace to her ashes, and a hopeful meeting, let us pray, at the Judgment Day. At last she rests in her native land, and just where in life she always wished to be placed when her life ended. God help us to follow her to the better land. Thank you. I have inscriptions on 3 sides of my marker, and they're kind of hard to read, but if you would like to read them, here's a copy. I don't know what a copy is, but someone brought me these, and it just makes it. I would encourage you to visit our Hubbard Plantation. Used to be a place they told me is called Hideaway Lake Bay. That's where my father-in-law is buried and my husband's first 4 children. I would highly encourage you to go visit that. The land up in that area, that was what used to be our plantation. And if you want to walk this direction in front of the marker, then you can view Richard, and that's my mother-in-law, and that's our oldest daughter, Cersei. Historical one.